The title of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish honours had belonged to him for years, symbols of duty carried with pride and responsibility. But what if the future of the British monarchy was determined by nothing more than the movement of a single pen? Hidden behind the closed doors of Windsor Castle, King Charles approved a royal decree that would reshape the institution forever. There was no televised statement, no discussion among the family, and no advance warning for those whose lives would be transformed by it. When the document was finally placed before Prince William, Queen Camilla, and the senior members of the royal household, the silence inside the room spoke louder than any words. Charles had already ensured that what he had signed could not be undone. Stay with this story, because it may change everything you believed about the royal family. One signature was all it took. Yet that single mark shifted the balance of power inside the monarchy. Inside a secure chamber at Windsor Castle, King Charles endorsed a decree that granted Catherine a level of influence over the future of the crown never seen before. No public announcement had been prepared for the nation. No consultation had taken place within the family. And when the order reached William, Camilla, and the senior royals, the heavy silence revealed just how serious the decision truly was. The king slowly looked around the room before lowering his hand from the page. Catherine sat across from him, composed but visibly tense, while Prince William kept his eyes fixed on the crimson folder resting before him. Queen Camilla remained perfectly still beside the monarch. Princess Anne and Prince Edward had surrendered their mobile phones outside the chamber, while royal aides waited silently beyond the locked doors. There was no longer any way to halt what had already begun. The atmosphere felt noticeably colder, yet no one dared glance towards the sealed entrance. Charles opened the folder and formally introduced what he called the Royal Continuity Decree. The order had been created to safeguard the monarchy during any future transfer of power. Through his signature, Catherine was appointed guardian of the crown's future, receiving authority over royal standards, public representation, succession preparation, and the conduct of working members of the royal family throughout any period of transition. The decree did not alter the line of succession. William would still become king. But it placed Catherine at the very center of preparing the monarchy for his reign. William carefully read the opening page twice. For a brief moment, pride crossed his face before giving way to concern. Without warning anyone, his father had elevated Catherine into an extraordinary position. She quietly kept her hands beneath the table, fully aware that such an honor also carried enormous risk. Senior relatives who had devoted decades of service to the crown would now find themselves accountable to her, and every decision she made carried the potential to deepen family divisions. Camilla finally broke the silence. She questioned why the decree had been prepared in complete secrecy and why she had only learned about it after it had already been signed. Charles gently placed the pen on the table. The king explained that the monarchy could no longer survive if loyalty remained divided, and the queen consort's expression immediately hardened. Princess Anne leaned forward and drew the papers closer. As she continued reading, she discovered a confidential appendix attached to the decree. Hidden within were additional powers that did not appear anywhere in the main document. She calmly asked when those new authorities would come into force. Charles answered without hesitation. They already had. Catherine carefully opened the appendix. Beneath its contents appeared the name of one senior royal, accompanied by restrictions involving access, responsibilities, and influence within the institution. William quietly exhaled as he looked over her shoulder. Camilla noticed his reaction immediately. In that single moment, what had first seemed like a ceremonial appointment suddenly became intensely personal. Before Catherine could fully understand why Charles had entrusted such remarkable authority to her, she would first have to confront those who believed that authority had been taken away from them instead. The decree was written with the formal language expected of royal documents, yet every consequence it carried struck on a deeply personal level. For Catherine, it represented a responsibility she had never publicly sought. For William, it served as both an expression of confidence and a silent warning. For Camilla, it felt as though another door had quietly closed without explanation. And for Charles, the decision carried the burden of a truth he was still unwilling to reveal. Around a single table sat 5 senior royals, each holding a completely different understanding of what loyalty to the crown truly demanded. Catherine eventually left the room carrying authority she had never imagined possessing. Years of discipline had prepared her to remain calm during moments of public scrutiny, family conflict, and private sorrow. Yet this challenge was unlike anything she had previously faced. Charles had made her the guardian of the monarchy's future, entrusting her with protecting royal standards while preparing the institution for the next reign. He believed in her because she had consistently placed duty above personal comfort. Yet that same trust now threatened to separate her from the very family she had been asked to protect. William quietly followed her into a private corridor and waited until the heavy doors closed behind them. He asked whether his father had warned her before the meeting had taken place. Catherine gently replied that he had not. She then admitted that several weeks earlier the king had asked her a single question. If forced to choose between preserving family harmony or ensuring the survival of the monarchy, which would she protect? At the time, she had refused to answer. Now William realized that the conversation had never been casual. It had been a test. Any mistake Catherine made from that point forward could one day be used against both of them. Camilla remained inside the meeting room long after everyone else had departed. Charles had barely looked towards her throughout the discussion, and that silence proved more painful than the decree itself. When Princess Anne entered the room, Camilla quietly asked whether everyone else had known about the decision before she had, and answered honestly that no one had known in advance, but she also admitted that she understood why Charles had made his choice. Catherine had repeatedly shown restraint while others allowed fear to influence their judgment. The explanation did not comfort Camilla. Instead, it left her feeling even more wounded. The Princess Royal remained beside her, yet neither woman pretended the resentment had disappeared. Prince Edward eventually eased some of the uncertainty by producing a confidential briefing note stored alongside the signed decree. He explained that 2 constitutional advisors had reviewed and witnessed the order several weeks before its formal approval. Their responsibility had been to ensure that every decision remained fully consistent with the monarchy's constitutional framework. Charles had not acted impulsively or emotionally. He had carefully protected the plan from the beginning, waiting only for the right moment to place his signature upon it. Catherine returned once more to the confidential appendix and discovered the first responsibility assigned to her. She would personally review the private privileges held by every senior working royal, including access to confidential correspondence, royal residences, and future state planning. William watched the expression on her face slowly change. In that instant he understood something important. This authority had not been created merely to prepare Catherine for her future role beside the king. Something serious had already happened inside the royal family, and Charles had designed the decree to ensure it could never happen again. The real answer did not lie within the document itself. It lay inside a private incident that had convinced the king the monarchy could no longer continue under its existing system. Every major royal crisis begins with a moment that seems insignificant until history later recognizes its importance. For Charles, that defining moment occurred during a confidential succession rehearsal held inside Buckingham Palace. A highly restricted document intended for only 4 individuals somehow appeared in the possession of someone who had never been authorized to see it. It was Catherine who uncovered the security breach. William immediately demanded an explanation. Before that evening came to an end, the king realized that the greatest threat to the monarchy's future was not coming from outside the palace walls. It was already moving quietly through its own corridors. 3 months before signing the decree, Charles had ordered a confidential rehearsal covering the first 72 hours following William's eventual accession to the throne. The exercise had been created to prepare the royal family for every immediate responsibility surrounding the transition, including emergency duties, official announcements, household restructuring, and safeguarding the younger generation of royals. Only King Charles, Prince William, Catherine, and Princess Anne were authorized to read the complete succession framework. That limitation existed for one simple reason. If even a single page escaped into the wrong hands, it could expose confidential concerns, planned responsibilities, and internal divisions that the palace had spent years trying to keep hidden. Catherine approached the responsibility with the same quiet discipline that had defined her years of royal service. She carefully reviewed how Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis would be protected, how palace staff should respond during an unexpected transition, and how the royal family could remain united if the crown changed hands without warning. Charles studied her recommendations twice. The king admired their measured judgment before ordering every page sealed and secured. The reason was simple. The framework addressed the monarchy's most sensitive question of all: who would truly hold influence once his reign came to an end? The warning arrived the very next evening. During a formal reception at the palace, Catherine noticed Queen Camilla's private secretary carrying what appeared to be a copied page taken from the confidential framework. Without creating a public scene, she quietly removed the document before escorting the aide into an empty anteroom. There, away from guests and palace staff, the Princess of Wales calmly demanded to know who had authorized the copy. The secretary hesitated only briefly before giving a single answer: the Queen Consort. Before midnight, Camilla found herself standing before King Charles. She insisted that she had requested only enough information to understand what would become of her household after William's accession and how she could continue protecting the king during the transition. Charles recognized the fear behind her explanation. But what troubled him was not her concern. It was the secrecy. She had chosen to bypass him entirely, and that decision blurred the line between personal affection and unofficial authority. William's frustration erupted soon afterwards. The prince confronted his father directly, accusing him of allowing private influence to replace clear constitutional boundaries. Charles responded with equal force, warning William not to mistake concern for betrayal. Yet later that night, sitting alone with the copied page resting before him, the king realized that his son was not fighting for power. He was afraid. Afraid that uncertain boundaries inside the family could damage his future reign before it had even begun. The final piece of the truth emerged during a recorded private consultation between Charles and Princess Anne. Speaking with the honesty only a sister could offer, Anne explained that no one within the royal family had ever been formally entrusted with defending the fragile line separating marriage, loyalty, personal affection, duty, and the long-term survival of the institution. That was why Charles had chosen Catherine. She had uncovered the breach. She had protected the confidential material. And despite everything that had happened, she had refused to exploit Camilla's embarrassment for personal advantage. When Camilla finally realized that one private decision had permanently altered her position within the monarchy, she requested a meeting with Catherine herself. There would be no courtiers, no private secretaries, no advisors, no king to interrupt the conversation. Camilla entered the room convinced that Catherine had accepted authority at her expense. Catherine walked in fully aware that remaining silent would only be interpreted as guilt. Between the two women stood years of restraint, quiet suspicion, and carefully managed public appearances. Camilla slowly pulled a chair away from the table, sat directly opposite Catherine, and asked the question no one else inside the royal household had been willing to ask. The meeting took place at Clarence House after Camilla personally requested complete privacy. Catherine accepted only after making one condition absolutely clear. No aides, no written notes, no recordings, Clarence House served as the Queen Consort's official London residence, but behind those closed doors its walls offered no protection from the truth. Royal titles could no longer soften what had already happened. Both women understood that the decree had fundamentally changed the relationship between them. Camilla spoke first. She admitted that she understood why the monarchy required careful preparation for William's future reign. What she could not accept was being judged through an order she had never been given the opportunity to question. Catherine answered quietly. The decree belonged to King Charles. She had not requested the authority. She had not drafted its clauses. She had not chosen the moment it would be signed. Yet Camilla's frustration remained. Because responsibility and consequence had become two very different things. Leaning forward, the Queen Consort asked the question that had weighed on her from the beginning. Did Catherine believe she was untrustworthy? The Princess of Wales allowed the silence to linger longer than either woman found comfortable. Then she answered. The breach had come from fear, not from malice. But fear could still become dangerous once it crossed boundaries that existed to protect the crown. Camilla's expression immediately hardened. She believed she had acted only to secure her future within an uncertain institution. Catherine had viewed that same action as a threat to the institution's future itself. For the first time, Catherine admitted something she had carefully hidden from everyone else. The appointment frightened her. She had no desire to become the woman blamed for every closed door, every restricted privilege, and every painful decision that would inevitably follow. Even so, she would never reject a responsibility simply because fulfilling it might make her unpopular. Camilla heard determination in those words. But she also recognized something far more unsettling. Catherine had already decided that she would never step back from the role Charles had given her. Camilla then revealed details from a documented private conversation she had once shared with the king. Charles had personally assured her that she would always be consulted whenever decisions affected her position within the royal family. The decree appeared to contradict that promise. Without raising her voice, Catherine opened the confidential appendix attached to the order and pointed directly to the relevant clause. Camilla's ceremonial position as Queen Consort remained entirely unchanged. However, her access to succession planning documents, confidential strategy papers, and future constitutional meetings would now require written authorization. The anger faded from Camilla's face. In its place came disappointment. Before leaving the room, she turned back towards Catherine with one final warning. One copied page could never justify powers this extensive. Someone had influenced Charles long before the family knew anything about the decree. Those words forced Catherine to look beyond the painful confrontation and towards the small group of people who had quietly helped transform the king's private concerns into permanent constitutional authority. Charles had signed the decree alone. But he had certainly not created it alone. Behind its carefully chosen language lay weeks of confidential discussions, handwritten revisions, and one argument repeated again and again. Personal affection could never again determine access to royal power. Determined to understand the truth, Catherine began tracing the document's origins. She expected to discover ambitious courtiers or political advisors. Instead, she found Princess Anne, an exhausted King Charles, and a confidential memorandum written by Prince William that completely changed her understanding of why Charles had acted before anyone else had the chance to stop him. Catherine met Princess Anne inside the late Queen Elizabeth's former sitting room, carrying a copy of the decree beneath her arm, and had deliberately chosen that room because it was there that Charles had first spoken openly about the plan, away from advisors, officials, and family expectations. The Princess Royal explained that the king's objective had never been to alter the lawful order of succession. His intention had been to build a framework capable of protecting stability without interfering with the constitutional process determining who inherited the throne. William would still become king. The newly created position existed only to ensure that the monarchy reached that moment without being weakened by private loyalties or unofficial influence, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had personally challenged every unnecessary compromise inside the document. She had insisted from the beginning that the Guardian's authority must be earned through years of proven duty rather than granted simply because of age, status, or bloodline. Catherine represented the only person capable of connecting 3 generations of the monarchy. She stood between Charles's present reign, William's future kingship, and the lives of George, Charlotte, and Louis beyond them. That unique position made her indispensable. It also made her exceptionally vulnerable. For the first time since receiving the decree, Catherine's composure finally faltered. Princess Anne quietly placed a confidential memorandum in front of her. It had been written by Prince William himself several weeks earlier. In it, the future king argued that his future queen consort needed clear constitutional authority long before any national emergency or family crisis could erupt. Only then, he believed, could the monarchy remain united when its greatest test finally arrived. The prince had never once written Catherine's name inside the memorandum, yet its meaning was impossible to misunderstand. Without ever saying it openly, William had helped create the burden that now rested firmly upon her shoulders. Later that evening, he finally faced her. William admitted that he had deliberately concealed the memorandum because he believed Catherine would refuse the role if she understood the price it would demand from their family. The future king insisted that he had only wanted to spare her from making an impossible decision. Catherine listened quietly before answering. Protection given without permission could become another form of betrayal. He had believed in her strength, yet at the same time denied her the right to decide how that strength should be used. William lowered his eyes before producing one final document. It was King Charles's handwritten amendment. The short edition declared that the Guardian of the Crown possessed the authority to privately challenge even the sovereign whenever a royal decision endangered the continuity of the monarchy itself. The role had never been intended as a ceremonial title. It carried the extraordinary power to question the king directly. A second clause proved even more significant. It authorized the Guardian to suspend access to confidential succession planning whenever trust had been compromised. Charles had personally underlined 2 words in dark ink. Without exception. Catherine understood immediately what those words truly meant. Her very first review resulted in one royal household being removed from the forthcoming Strategic Council. Before Charles had the opportunity to explain the decision himself, the news reached Camilla. Within moments, what had begun as constitutional policy became a deeply personal humiliation. The decree had started as little more than words written on paper. Yet the first name removed from the council demonstrated that Catherine's authority now possessed the power to alter lives immediately. The monarchy had not felt different when Charles signed the decree. It felt different the moment the first palace door remained closed. Camilla arrived expecting to take her usual place beside the king at the Crown Strategy Council. Instead, she found her name missing from the official attendance list waiting outside the chamber. Under the new security arrangements, Catherine had authorized a smaller gathering. Charles had approved the recommendation. As Camilla stood before the sealed entrance, the consequences of the decree became far more painful than the carefully written language contained inside it. Catherine's first official decision limited attendance to Charles, William, Princess and Prince Edward, and herself. The document breach remained under formal review. The Crown Strategy Council existed as a confidential meeting where the monarchy prepared for future national emergencies and the eventual transition of the crown. Because the discussions focused on succession planning rather than public ceremony, Catherine believed that everyone present had to possess unquestioned security clearance. The restriction had always been intended as temporary, but because it took effect immediately, it felt less like precaution and far more like judgment. Camilla looked down at the attendance card without speaking. She folded it once, handed it back, then quietly walked away with every trace of her dignity still intact. Inside the chamber, Charles heard her footsteps slowly disappearing along the corridor. The king never rose from his chair. Both hands remained resting firmly upon the table as he convinced himself that staying seated protected the integrity of the process. Yet every passing second of silence made the decision feel increasingly personal. William noticed the tension written across his father's face. At the same time, Catherine recognized that the very first use of her new authority had already caused genuine pain. When the council finally concluded, Camilla confronted Charles directly. She asked whether being his wife still carried his trust, or whether the decree had quietly reduced their marriage to little more than ceremony. The king answered without hesitation. He loved her. But love alone could never provide automatic access to every confidential matter concerning the crown. Camilla heard the distinction clearly. It brought her no comfort. To her, the closed door represented undeniable proof that affection and constitutional influence had finally been separated. And she now stood on the weaker side of that divide. Not long afterwards, Catherine received a detailed security review exposing an even older breach. Months before the succession rehearsal, another confidential document had already been copied and circulated. The recent incident had not been the beginning. It had simply been the first one discovered. The earlier document concerned future residential arrangements following William's accession. Members of Camilla's household had quietly shared the paper among themselves. They feared losing their homes, responsibilities, and positions once the next reign officially began. As Catherine continued reading, the entire crisis suddenly appeared in a different light. Camilla had undoubtedly crossed an important boundary. Yet frightened employees and uncertain futures had fueled the atmosphere of secrecy. Charles himself had failed to explain what the transition would mean for those closest to him. Where clear leadership should have existed, uncertainty had been allowed to grow. For the first time, Catherine realized that the authority she had been given seemed designed to manage consequences rather than prevent them. She stopped asking what power Charles had entrusted to her. Instead, she began asking what responsibility he had quietly tried to avoid. Carrying the decree beneath her arm, Catherine entered the king's private library. Although Charles invited her to sit, she remained standing. There were no lawyers present, no palace officials, no family members waiting outside, only a father-in-law, a future queen, and the weight of a decision neither of them could ever reverse. Catherine placed the decree carefully upon his desk. Then she spoke. She would serve the crown with complete loyalty, but she would never become the shield behind which Charles avoided difficult conversations with his own family. Before answering, the king felt the force of her accusation. Catherine continued. The Guardian's role could survive only if the family regarded it as a responsibility that protected stability rather than a weapon directed at Camilla or anyone else who questioned palace decisions. The Guardian existed to defend royal standards while preparing the monarchy for future transition. If that authority ever became associated with punishment instead of protection, every decision she made would only deepen the very divisions she had been appointed to prevent. Charles admitted the truth slowly. Every attempt to establish future boundaries had become entangled with marriage, loyalty, guilt, personal affection, and his own fear of appearing weak. Time after time, he postponed the conversations that mattered most because each one threatened to hurt someone he loved. Eventually, instead of speaking honestly, he signed the decree in secret. He hoped structure could solve what honesty had repeatedly failed to confront. Catherine refused to accept that explanation. His silence, she said, had simply transferred the emotional burden directly onto her shoulders. Charles had granted her authority, but he had also left her to carry Camilla's resentment, William's anxiety, and the growing suspicion spreading throughout the royal family. She had been praised endlessly for her strength, yet never given the opportunity to choose whether she wished to carry such a burden at all. Charles slowly removed his glasses before staring silently at the decree resting between them. At last, the king confessed the truth. Part of the reason he had chosen Catherine was because he trusted her to accomplish everything he himself had repeatedly delayed. She would enforce the necessary boundaries. She would demand uncomfortable clarity. She would endure the anger that inevitably followed. The confession left Catherine deeply shaken. It filled her with frustration. But beneath that anger lay something even more painful. The man standing before her had not simply appointed a guardian of the crown. He had quietly placed his own unfinished battles into her hands and expected her to fight them in his place. Catherine agreed to remain in the position, but only after setting two clear conditions. First, King Charles would personally explain the decree to the entire royal family and publicly accept responsibility for every clause it contained. Under no circumstances would he allow anyone to believe that Catherine had requested the powers or influenced the decision. Second, she insisted on an independent review of every royal household. Neutral constitutional advisors would examine confidential access procedures so that anxious staff members could no longer manipulate sensitive information or leak restricted documents simply to protect their own positions. Charles accepted both conditions without hesitation. He signed an additional statement confirming his responsibility before summoning Camilla, William, Anne, and Edward for one final private meeting. That evening, Catherine sat beside the king. Not as the person blamed for his decision, but as the woman who had compelled the monarch to accept ownership of it. The family's private reckoning had finally reached its conclusion. Yet by the following morning, the sealed decree had escaped the palace walls. And once it entered the public domain, the nation would give it an entirely different meaning. At dawn, what had once been a closely guarded royal secret became the biggest story in Britain. Television newsrooms abandoned their planned broadcasts. Camera crews gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Journalists crowded the gates. Within hours, Catherine's newly confirmed authority dominated every discussion about the future of the monarchy. Yet the image that captured the country's attention was not a speech, nor a balcony appearance. It was a single photograph. Catherine arriving alone at Buckingham Palace, carrying the Crimson Decree folder beneath her arm. Above the photograph, newspapers carried the same unmistakable message. King Charles had entrusted the future of the crown to Prince William's wife. Before breakfast, the palace released the king's signed public statement. It formally confirmed the Royal Continuity Decree, describing it as an official constitutional order created to safeguard the monarchy throughout future transitions between reigns. The statement also made one point absolutely clear. Catherine's appointment strengthened William's future reign. It did not replace him. William remained the lawful heir to the throne. Catherine's responsibility would be to prepare the royal family, uphold royal standards, and oversee access to confidential succession planning. The distinction mattered enormously. The country needed to see continuity, not a hidden struggle for power. Political commentators immediately described the decree as the clearest indication yet that preparations for the next reign had already begun. Some praised Charles for introducing accountability within an institution that had often relied upon silence. Others argued that the decree exposed deep distrust at the highest levels of the royal family. Every debate eventually returned to the same uncomfortable question. What had happened behind palace doors to make such extraordinary authority necessary? At Kensington Palace, William watched the news coverage alongside Catherine. He admired the calmness with which she accepted every headline. Yet beneath that admiration lay unmistakable guilt. Once again, he apologized for helping create a role she had never knowingly agreed to carry. Catherine listened before quietly answering. She understood why he had acted. But understanding did not erase pain. Trust, she said, could survive even its deepest wounds. Only if those wounds were acknowledged honestly. That same morning, Camilla found the day's newspaper waiting beside Charles. Its front page described Catherine as the woman now entrusted with protecting the future of the monarchy. The Queen Consort slowly placed the paper back upon the table. She told the king that she would support the decree publicly. Privately, however, rebuilding trust would take considerably longer. Charles accepted her words without argument. He understood that public unity could never erase personal hurt. Outside Buckingham Palace, evening bulletins appeared across giant news screens as crowds gathered beneath the famous balcony. Applause broke out when Catherine's appointment was officially confirmed. Moments later, silence replaced celebration as Charles's personal acceptance of responsibility was read aloud. For one remarkable moment, national excitement gave way to quiet judgment. Soon afterwards, the palace issued a second announcement. Every senior royal household, including those of both Charles and Camilla, would undergo exactly the same confidential access review. Catherine had not singled out one individual. She had established one standard for everyone. Public approval gave legitimacy to her new role. But the greatest test still remained inside the royal family itself. When cameras were finally invited to witness the family's next official gathering, the true verdict would not be delivered through another royal decree. It would be revealed simply by where each member of the family chose to stand. The answer arrived without confrontation. At the next full gathering of the royal family, Charles entered first. Camilla walked beside him. William followed with Catherine at his side. No one had been expelled. No line of succession had been rewritten. No throne had changed hands. Yet every person in the room understood that the monarchy itself had quietly changed forever. Charles had acknowledged the danger created by blurred authority. Camilla had confronted the consequences of acting from fear. William had learned that protection offered without honesty could easily become betrayal. And Catherine now faced the greatest question of all. What kind of power would she choose to exercise? Before anyone else could speak, Charles addressed the family. He accepted full responsibility for the decree. The king confirmed that every decision contained within it had been his alone. He explained that Catherine's authority existed for one purpose: to prepare the monarchy for transition, to enforce equal standards, and to ensure that private relationships could never again override royal duty. A royal transition marked the period during which authority passed from one reign to the next. Every member of the family now understood exactly why that preparation mattered. Camilla listened carefully without once looking away. Charles made it equally clear that her dignity, ceremonial position, and role as queen consort remained completely intact. She had not been removed. She had not been replaced. She had not been stripped of public honor. The restrictions concerned only confidential succession planning. Those same rules would apply equally to every royal household. Camilla would continue standing beside her husband. But personal affection would no longer guarantee unrestricted access to sensitive matters of state. Charles then turned towards Catherine. In front of the entire family, he apologized. He admitted that he had placed an enormous burden upon her without first asking for her consent. He had trusted her strength, yet denied her the opportunity to choose. Catherine accepted the apology with dignity, but she refused to soften the truth. She promised that the guardian's authority would always be exercised through consultation, written justification, and careful restraint, rather than personal opinion. Authority, she declared, would never become an instrument of revenge. After the address concluded, Camilla quietly approached Catherine. There were no dramatic embraces, no carefully staged public gestures. The queen consort simply said that trust could never be restored through titles alone. It could only be rebuilt through consistent actions. Catherine agreed. Their conflict ended not with forced warmth, but with an honest boundary both women were finally willing to respect. William then offered his support through an official recorded family statement released across the palace's public accounts. The prince declared that Catherine's authority had never existed because she was his wife. It existed because of her discipline, her discretion, her integrity, and her willingness to challenge even King Charles whenever the crown required complete honesty. Finally, Charles lifted the crimson folder and placed it into Catherine's hands. She gently closed it, passed an official copy to Princess Anne for permanent safekeeping, then quietly took her place beside William. Camilla remained standing beside the king. The new constitutional order had not been built through exile or punishment. It had been built through responsibility. The signature that had once divided the room ultimately gave the royal family something secrecy never could: a clear boundary, an honest reckoning, and a future Catherine was finally ready to protect. Now you know the complete story behind the royal continuity decree. You know what King Charles signed. You know why Catherine was chosen. And you know the price every member of the family paid because of that decision. But the next chapter involves someone we have not even discussed yet. And what happens next may prove even more surprising than everything you've heard so far. If you've stayed with the story until the end, make sure to leave a like because stories like these rarely stay hidden forever. Share your opinion in the comments below. Do you believe King Charles was right to give Catherine this extraordinary authority? Or do you think he went too far? Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter of this remarkable royal story.